In the shadowy depths of the Cold War, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became the epicenter of some of the most secretive and controversial scientific experiments in American history. From the creation of the atomic bomb to human radiation experiments, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory holds secrets that are only now coming to light. Join us as we delve into the Oak Ridge experiments and uncover the dark secrets of Cold War science. The origins of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory are deeply intertwined with the Manhattan Project, the top-secret World War II program tasked with developing the atomic bomb. In the early 1940s, the United States was engaged in a race against Nazi Germany to harness the power of nuclear fission, a scientific breakthrough that held the potential to create weapons of unprecedented destructive power. To achieve this, the U.S. government embarked on an ambitious and highly secretive project, which would lead to the creation of several research and production sites across the country. Among these sites, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, would play a crucial role. The decision to establish a nuclear research and production facility in Oak Ridge was influenced by several factors. First and foremost, the site needed to be remote and secure, far from major population centers, to maintain secrecy and minimize the risk of espionage or sabotage. Oak Ridge, located in the Appalachian Mountains, provided an ideal location with its natural seclusion and proximity to the Tennessee Valley Authority, which could supply the enormous amounts of electricity needed for the project's operations. In 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, under the direction of General Leslie Groves, began the rapid development of the Oak Ridge site. This area, which had previously been sparsely populated farmland, was transformed almost overnight into a bustling hub of scientific and industrial activity. The government forcibly acquired land from local residents, many of whom were unaware of the true purpose of the project. By the end of 1942, the construction of the Oak Ridge Reservation was in full swing, and the once quiet rural community was becoming a focal point of the Manhattan Project. Oak Ridge was officially established as the Clinton Engineer Works, a code name that concealed its true function. The site quickly grew into a sprawling complex that included several key facilities, each with a specific role in the development of nuclear weapons. The most notable of these facilities were the Y-12 plant, the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, and the X-10 graphite reactor. These facilities were involved in the enrichment of uranium, a critical process for producing the fissile material needed for atomic bombs. The Y-12 plant was tasked with enriching uranium using a process called electromagnetic separation. This method, which involved using powerful magnets to separate uranium isotopes, was cutting-edge technology at the time. The plant's construction and operation required an enormous workforce, and by 1945, Y-12 employed over 22,000 workers. Despite the secrecy surrounding their work, the employees at Y-12 played a crucial role in producing the uranium-235 used in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The K-25 plant utilized gaseous diffusion to separate uranium isotopes, another advanced technique that required significant scientific and engineering expertise. The facility was one of the largest buildings in the world at the time of its construction, covering 44 acres. The K-25 plant's operation was a monumental engineering achievement and a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the scientists and engineers involved in the Manhattan Project. The X-10 graphite reactor, also known as the Clinton pile, was the world's second artificial nuclear reactor and the first designed for continuous operation. It served as a pilot plant for the production of plutonium, another key material for nuclear weapons. The reactor's successful operation provided critical data and experience that paved the way for the large-scale production of plutonium at the Hanford site in Washington state. The plutonium produced at Hanford was used in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Life in Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project was characterized by secrecy and urgency. The town, which had grown to accommodate tens of thousands of workers and their families, operated under strict security protocols. Workers were often unaware of the true nature of their tasks, as information was compartmentalized to maintain secrecy. Residents lived in government-constructed housing, and the entire community was surrounded by fences and guarded by military personnel. Despite these constraints, Oak Ridge developed into a vibrant community with schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities to support its growing population. The success of the Manhattan Project and the subsequent use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked a turning point in world history and solidified Oak Ridge's place in the annals of scientific achievement. However, the end of World War II did not mean the end of Oak Ridge's role in nuclear research. In 1943, even before the war ended, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, ORNL, was established to continue and expand upon the scientific work initiated during the Manhattan Project. ORNL was initially focused on nuclear research and the development of nuclear reactors. The laboratory quickly became a hub for scientific innovation, attracting top scientists from around the world. In the post-war years, ORNL expanded its research scope to include a wide range of scientific disciplines, from materials science to biology. The laboratory's work contributed to significant advancements in energy production, medical research, and environmental science. One of the key areas of research at ORNL was the study of radiation and its effects on human health and the environment. This focus on radiation research was driven by the dual needs of understanding the risks associated with nuclear technology and developing safety protocols for workers and the public. However, some of the methods used in these studies, particularly the human radiation experiments, would later become highly controversial. The human radiation experiments conducted at ORNL and other facilities across the United States involved exposing individuals to radioactive substances to study the effects of radiation on the human body. These experiments were often carried out without the informed consent of the participants, many of whom were vulnerable populations such as hospital patients, prisoners, and military personnel. The ethical implications of these experiments were profound, and the full extent of these activities remained hidden for decades. As the Cold War intensified, ORNL's research took on additional significance. The laboratory's work contributed to the development of nuclear weapons, propulsion systems for naval vessels, and other military technologies. The strategic importance of ORNL and its research made it a key component of the United States defense infrastructure. Despite the secrecy and controversy surrounding some of its activities, ORNL also made significant contributions to civilian scientific research. The laboratory played a pioneering role in the development of nuclear medicine, including the use of radioisotopes for medical diagnosis and treatment. ORNL's research in material science led to the development of new alloys and composites with applications in various industries. The laboratory also contributed to environmental science, studying the impact of radiation on ecosystems and developing methods for managing nuclear waste. The legacy of Oak Ridge and ORNL is a complex one, reflecting both the remarkable scientific achievements and the ethical challenges of the atomic age. The contributions of Oak Ridge to the Manhattan Project and the subsequent advancements in nuclear science and technology are undeniable. However, the darker aspects of its history, particularly the human radiation experiments, serve as a cautionary tale about the ethical responsibilities of scientific research. In conclusion, the birth of Oak Ridge and the establishment of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory are deeply rooted in the urgent and secretive efforts of the Manhattan Project during World War II. The transformation of a rural area into a center of scientific innovation and industrial might was a monumental achievement, driven by the needs of wartime and the pursuit of nuclear technology. The legacy of Oak Ridge, marked by both groundbreaking discoveries and controversial practices, continues to shape our understanding of science, ethics, and the balance between progress and responsibility. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory's involvement in human radiation experiments represents one of the most controversial and ethically troubling aspects of its history. During and after World War II, as the United States ramped up its nuclear research and development efforts, scientists and government officials became increasingly interested in understanding the effects of radiation on the human body. This interest was driven by the dual needs of protecting workers and the public from radiation exposure and advancing the use of radiation in medicine and industry. However, the methods employed to gather this knowledge often involved unethical practices, including experiments on unsuspecting and vulnerable individuals. The origins of the human radiation experiments at Oak Ridge can be traced back to the Manhattan Project. As the project progressed and the use of nuclear weapons became a reality, concerns about the potential health effects of radiation exposure grew. The scientists and military officials involved in the project recognized that radiation posed significant risks, but there was limited understanding of its long-term effects on human health. This lack of knowledge spurred a series of studies aimed at exploring the biological impact of radiation. One of the earliest and most notorious sets of experiments involved the injection of plutonium into human subjects. In 1945, as part of the Manhattan Project's efforts to understand the dangers of radiation, scientists at the University of California, San Francisco, injected plutonium into 18 patients without their informed consent. These patients, who were suffering from various illnesses and had little understanding of the true nature of the experiments, were used to study how plutonium moved through the body and its effects on human tissues. The data gathered from these experiments were intended to help establish safety guidelines for nuclear workers and inform medical treatments for radiation exposure. Following the end of World War II, the focus on radiation research continued to grow, driven by the onset of the Cold War and the escalating arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory, already a key player in nuclear research, became a central site for radiation studies. The laboratory's expertise in handling radioactive materials and its extensive facilities made it an ideal location for these experiments. During the late 1940s and 1950s, Oak Ridge researchers conducted a variety of human radiation experiments. These studies included the deliberate exposure of individuals to radioactive isotopes, such as iodine-131, calcium-45, and iron-59. The subjects of these experiments ranged from healthy volunteers to patients with terminal illnesses. In many cases, the participants were not fully informed about the nature of the experiments or the potential risks involved. This lack of informed consent was a clear violation of ethical standards, even by the less stringent norms of the time. One particularly disturbing set of experiments conducted at Oak Ridge involved the exposure of pregnant women to radioactive isotopes. Researchers were interested in understanding how radiation affected fetal development and whether radioactive materials could cross the placenta. Pregnant women, often from low-income backgrounds and seeking medical care, were administered radioactive iron without being told of the potential dangers to themselves or their unborn children. The results of these experiments provided valuable data on radiation transfer to fetuses, but at a significant ethical and human cost. In addition to the experiments on patients and volunteers, Oak Ridge also conducted studies on military personnel. During the 1950s, soldiers were exposed to varying levels of radiation as part of studies designed to understand the effects of radiation on the body and to develop protective measures for troops in the event of a nuclear war. These experiments included exposing soldiers to radioactive clouds created by detonating nuclear devices and observing the immediate and long-term health effects. The soldiers were often unaware of the true nature of the experiments and the risks they were taking. The secrecy surrounding these experiments was maintained through rigorous security measures and the classification of research findings. The government and military officials overseeing these studies argued that the knowledge gained was essential for national security and public health. However, the lack of transparency and the use of vulnerable populations without proper consent raised serious ethical concerns. The ethical implications of the human radiation experiments at Oak Ridge began to surface in the 1970s and 1980s as investigative journalists and researchers started to uncover the extent of these studies. Reports of unethical experiments conducted on unsuspecting individuals sparked public outrage and led to calls for accountability and transparency. The growing awareness of these practices coincided with broader societal changes, including the civil rights movement and increased scrutiny of government activities. The full extent of the human radiation experiments was not publicly acknowledged until the 1990s. In 1993, a series of articles published by the Albuquerque Tribune brought national attention to the experiments, detailing the cases of patients who had been injected with plutonium without their knowledge. These revelations prompted the U.S. government to take action. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, HEHRE, to investigate these abuses and provide recommendations for addressing the ethical violations. The ACTRE conducted a thorough review of the experiments, examining thousands of documents and interviewing survivors and family members of the victims. The committee's final report, released in 1995, confirmed the unethical nature of the experiments and acknowledged the suffering of the victims. The report recommended compensation for the victims and their families and called for reforms to ensure that such abuses would not happen again. President Clinton issued a public apology to the victims, acknowledging the government's role in the unethical experiments and pledging to uphold higher ethical standards in the future. The legacy of the human radiation experiments at Oak Ridge has had a lasting impact on the field of bioethics and the conduct of scientific research. The revelations of these abuses led to significant changes in the ethical oversight of research involving human subjects. One of the most important outcomes was the establishment of stricter guidelines for informed consent, ensuring that participants in scientific studies are fully aware of the nature of the research and any potential risks involved. Institutional review boards, IRBs, were created to oversee research proposals and ensure that ethical standards are upheld. The lessons learned from the human radiation experiments have also influenced the development of international ethical standards. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964 and subsequently revised, sets out ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects. The Belmont Report, published in 1979 by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, established key ethical principles, including respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, which continue to guide research practices today. The story of the human radiation experiments at Oak Ridge is a stark reminder of the potential for ethical violations in the pursuit of scientific knowledge and national security. It underscores the importance of transparency, accountability, and the protection of human rights in scientific research. The victims of these experiments, many of whom suffered severe health consequences and psychological trauma, serve as a poignant testament to the need for rigorous ethical standards and oversight in all scientific endeavors. In conclusion, the human radiation experiments conducted at Oak Ridge National Laboratory during and after World War II represent a troubling chapter in the history of scientific research. Driven by the urgency of the Manhattan Project and the Cold War, these experiments often involved unethical practices, including the use of unsuspecting and vulnerable individuals without their informed consent. The legacy of these experiments has had a profound impact on the field of bioethics, leading to significant changes in the ethical oversight of research and the development of international standards. The story of Oak Ridge's human radiation experiments serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of upholding ethical principles in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The Oak Ridge human radiation experiments were shrouded in secrecy for decades, and it wasn't until the 1990s that the full extent of these unethical practices began to emerge. The cover-up of these experiments, the eventual exposure of the truth, and the subsequent investigations revealed a complex web of deception, bureaucracy, and ethical failures. This chapter delves into the secretive nature of these studies, the mechanisms of the cover-up, the role of whistleblowers and investigative journalists in uncovering the truth, and the governmental response that followed. From the outset, the human radiation experiments conducted at Oak Ridge and other sites were classified as top secret, justified under the guise of national security. The Manhattan Project and subsequent Cold War projects operated under intense secrecy, with information compartmentalized to prevent espionage and ensure the success of U.S. nuclear efforts. This secrecy extended to the human radiation experiments, which were considered essential for understanding the effects of radiation on human health and developing safety protocols for nuclear workers and the general public. The secrecy was maintained through several layers of bureaucracy. Research findings were classified, and only a select few individuals had access to the full scope of the experiments. This compartmentalization meant that many of the scientists, doctors, and technicians involved in the experiments were unaware of the broader context or the ethical implications of their work. Additionally, participants in the experiments were often kept in the dark about the true nature of the studies and the potential risks involved, a clear violation of informed consent principles. The cover-up of the human radiation experiments was facilitated by a culture of deference to authority and trust in scientific progress. During the mid-20th century, there was a widespread belief in the infallibility of science and the necessity of extraordinary measures to protect national security. This belief was particularly strong in the context of the Cold War, where the threat of nuclear conflict loomed large. As a result, ethical concerns were often subordinated to the perceived imperative of advancing scientific knowledge and maintaining a strategic advantage over adversaries. However, as the Cold War began to wind down in the late 20th century, the public and political climate started to change. Greater emphasis was placed on transparency, accountability, and human rights. This shift provided a fertile ground for whistleblowers and investigative journalists to start uncovering the truth about the human radiation experiments. One of the key moments in the exposure of these experiments came in 1993, when the Albuquerque Tribune published a series of articles detailing the plutonium injection experiments. These articles, written by investigative journalist Eileen Wellsome, were based on declassified documents and interviews with survivors and families of the victims. Wellsome's reporting brought national attention to the unethical practices that had been hidden for decades and sparked widespread outrage. The Tribune's revelations prompted a flurry of activity from other media outlets and advocacy groups. Journalists and researchers began digging into government archives, filing Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests, and interviewing those involved in the experiments. This collective effort gradually pieced together the full extent of the human radiation experiments, revealing a pattern of deception and ethical violations. The growing public outcry and media attention forced the U.S. government to respond. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACHRE, to investigate the abuses and provide recommendations for addressing the ethical violations. The ACHRE was tasked with reviewing thousands of documents, interviewing survivors and family members, and assessing the ethical and scientific merits of the experiments. The ACHRE's investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern of unethical practices. The committee's final report, released in 1995, confirmed that many of the experiments had been conducted without informed consent and had subjected participants to significant health risks. The report also highlighted the failures of oversight and accountability that had allowed these abuses to occur. In response to the report's findings, President Clinton issued a public apology to the victims and their families, acknowledging the government's role in the unethical experiments and pledging to uphold higher ethical standards in the future. The ACHRE's report and the subsequent public apology marked a significant turning point in the recognition of the human radiation experiments. However, the journey to uncover the full truth and achieve justice for the victims was far from over. Survivors and families of the victims continued to seek compensation and recognition for the harm they had suffered. Legal battles ensued, with victims filing lawsuits against the government and the institutions involved in the experiments. These legal efforts were met with varying degrees of success. Some victims received financial compensation and medical support, while others faced legal and bureaucratic obstacles. The complexity of proving causation between the experiments and subsequent health issues, along with the passage of time, made it difficult for many victims to achieve full justice. Nevertheless, the legal battles kept the issue in the public eye and underscored the need for ongoing accountability and support for the victims. The exposure of the human radiation experiments also had a profound impact on the field of bioethics and the conduct of scientific research. The revelations prompted a re-evaluation of ethical standards and oversight mechanisms to ensure that such abuses would not occur again. One of the most significant outcomes was the establishment of stricter guidelines for informed consent, ensuring that participants in scientific studies are fully aware of the nature of the research and any potential risks involved. Institutional review boards, IRBs, were created to oversee research proposals and ensure that ethical standards are upheld. These boards, composed of scientists, ethicists, and community representatives, review research protocols to protect the rights and welfare of participants. The development of IRBs and other oversight mechanisms has been crucial in fostering a culture of ethical accountability in scientific research. The lessons learned from the human radiation experiments have also influenced the development of international ethical standards. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964 and subsequently revised, sets out ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects. The Belmont Report, published in 1979 by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, established key ethical principles, including respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, which continue to guide research practices today. The story of the human radiation experiments at Oak Ridge serves as a stark reminder of the potential for ethical violations in the pursuit of scientific knowledge and national security. It underscores the importance of transparency, accountability, and the protection of human rights in scientific research. The victims of these experiments, many of whom suffered severe health consequences and psychological trauma, serve as a poignant testament to the need for rigorous ethical standards and oversight in all scientific endeavors. The legacy of the human radiation experiments extends beyond the realm of bioethics and scientific research. The exposure of these abuses has contributed to a broader societal awareness of the importance of ethical accountability and the protection of vulnerable populations. It has highlighted the need for robust mechanisms to ensure that government and scientific institutions are held accountable for their actions. The story of the human radiation experiments also underscores the critical role of whistleblowers and investigative journalists in uncovering the truth and holding powerful institutions accountable. The courage and determination of individuals like Eileen Wellsome, who risked their careers to expose these abuses, have had a lasting impact on the pursuit of justice and the advancement of ethical standards. In conclusion, the secret studies and cover-ups associated with the human radiation experiments at Oak Ridge represent a complex and troubling chapter in the history of scientific research. The secrecy and deception that characterized these experiments allowed significant ethical violations to occur, causing harm to vulnerable individuals and undermining public trust in scientific institutions. The eventual exposure of these abuses, driven by the efforts of whistleblowers, journalists, and advocacy groups, prompted significant changes in ethical standards and oversight mechanisms. The legacy of the human radiation experiments serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of transparency, accountability, and the protection of human rights in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The impact of the Oak Ridge experiments on the victims and their families was profound and far-reaching, extending beyond immediate physical health issues to encompass long-term psychological, social, and economic consequences. The human radiation experiments conducted at Oak Ridge and other sites involved exposing individuals to dangerous levels of radiation without their informed consent, leading to severe and often lifelong repercussions. Many of the victims of these experiments were patients in hospitals, prisoners, military personnel, and other vulnerable populations who were in positions where they could not easily refuse participation. These individuals were often chosen because they were deemed expendable or already suffering from severe illnesses. As a result, they became unwitting subjects in experiments that exposed them to plutonium, uranium, iodine, and other radioactive substances, sometimes through injection, ingestion, or inhalation. One of the most immediate impacts on the victims was the development of acute radiation sickness, which could include symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, hair loss, and skin burns. These symptoms were often severe and debilitating, causing significant distress and suffering. For many victims, the exposure also led to long-term health problems, including various forms of cancer, organ damage, and other chronic conditions that severely impacted their quality of life. The psychological impact of learning that they had been used as subjects in secret radiation experiments without their knowledge or consent was immense. Many victims experienced feelings of betrayal, anger, and helplessness upon discovering the truth. The realization that trusted institutions and professionals had violated their rights and put their health at risk led to deep mistrust in medical and governmental authorities. This mistrust often extended to their families and communities, creating a pervasive sense of fear and skepticism about scientific and medical practices. Families of the victims also suffered significantly. Many family members were unaware of the experiments until years or even decades later, discovering the truth through media reports, government disclosures, or advocacy efforts. This delayed revelation often compounded the trauma as families grappled with the implications of the experiments on their loved ones' health and the betrayal of trust by institutions they believed were protecting them. The economic impact on the victims and their families was another critical issue. Many victims faced substantial medical bills as they sought treatment for the health problems caused by radiation exposure. The chronic nature of these health issues often meant ongoing medical expenses, loss of income due to inability to work, and financial instability. For families, this economic burden added to the emotional and psychological toll, creating a cycle of hardship and stress. The search for justice and compensation for the victims and their families was a long and arduous process. Initial efforts to seek recognition and redress were met with resistance and bureaucratic obstacles. Many victims faced difficulties in proving that their health issues were directly linked to the radiation experiments, as documentation was often incomplete or classified, and the passage of time made gathering evidence challenging. Despite these challenges, survivors and families persisted in their quest for justice, often with the support of advocacy groups and legal professionals. The establishment of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACRE, in 1994, marked a significant step forward. The ACRE's investigation and subsequent report brought much-needed attention to the plight of the victims, providing a comprehensive account of the experiments and their ethical violations. The ACRE's report recommended compensation for the victims and their families, acknowledging the government's responsibility for the harm caused by the experiments. Following the report, President Bill Clinton issued a public apology, recognizing the government's role in the unethical experiments and pledging to uphold higher ethical standards in the future. This apology, while symbolic, was an important step in acknowledging the victims' suffering and the need for accountability. In the aftermath of the ACRE report, the government implemented several measures to provide compensation and support to the victims. These measures included financial compensation for medical expenses, pensions for affected families, and access to specialized healthcare services. While these efforts provided some relief, many victims and families felt that the compensation was insufficient and that the full extent of their suffering had not been adequately addressed. The long-term legacy of the Oak Ridge experiments also had broader societal implications. The exposure of these unethical practices prompted significant changes in the ethical oversight of scientific research, leading to the establishment of stricter guidelines for informed consent and the creation of institutional review boards, IRBs, to oversee research involving human subjects. These changes were crucial in ensuring that the rights and welfare of research participants were protected and that similar ethical violations would not occur in the future. Education and public memory have played a vital role in addressing the legacy of the Oak Ridge experiments. Museums, memorials, and educational programs dedicated to documenting and commemorating the victims' experiences serve as important tools for preserving this history and promoting ethical awareness. The Memory and Human Rights Museum in Santiago, Chile, and the ESMA Museum in Buenos Aires are notable examples of institutions dedicated to documenting state-sponsored abuses and educating future generations about the importance of human rights and ethical standards in research. Public memory initiatives often involve survivors, families, and advocacy groups working together to create spaces for reflection and education. These initiatives help to ensure that the stories of the victims are not forgotten and that the lessons of the past are passed on to future generations. They also provide opportunities for dialogue and reconciliation, helping to bridge divides and promote understanding and healing. The impact of the Oak Ridge experiments on contemporary discussions about scientific ethics and human rights is significant. The revelations about these experiments have contributed to a broader awareness of the importance of ethical accountability in scientific research and the protection of vulnerable populations. They have highlighted the need for robust mechanisms to ensure that government and scientific institutions are held accountable for their actions, and that the rights and welfare of research participants are safeguarded. In conclusion, the impact of the Oak Ridge experiments on the victims and their families was profound and far-reaching, encompassing physical health issues, psychological trauma, economic hardship, and long-term mistrust in institutions. The quest for justice and compensation was a long and difficult process, marked by significant challenges and resistance. The legacy of these experiments has had broader societal implications, prompting important changes in the ethical oversight of scientific research and contributing to a greater awareness of the importance of ethical accountability and human rights. The story of the Oak Ridge experiments serves as a powerful reminder of the need to uphold ethical principles in scientific research. The Oak Ridge experiments represent a dark chapter in the history of American science, a time when the pursuit of knowledge came at the expense of human dignity and rights. By uncovering and acknowledging these past wrongs, we can ensure that history does not repeat itself. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay informed, stay ethical, and remember the lessons of the past to guide the future.